You know, ladies and gentlemen, there's an ongoing argument about slavery and how that many people suffered slavery throughout world history, and that African Americans, so-called African Americans, are not the only ones to experience slavery. Well, I'm here to tell you, although that is absolutely true, there were different types of slavery. So today we're going to take a look and we're going to explain exactly what was slavery versus chattel slavery here in America. Chattel slavery was a completely different type of inhumane treatment that only black people suffered in America. In 1640 in Virginia, a court sentenced a black man named John Punch to servitude for life, establishing a legal precedent that distinguished the fate of black and white indentured servants. In 1641, the Massachusetts Bay Colony became the first colony to legalize slavery here in America. In 1661 through 1662, Virginia passed laws that officially recognized slavery and stipulated that a child born to an enslaved mother would also be a slave, making the institution self-perpetuating.
Chattel slavery is a specific, severe form of slavery where people are treated as personal property, or chattel, to be bought, sold, and inherited, lacking all rights and legal standing. During chattel slavery, people were treated as property. Enslaved individuals were considered objects or commodities, much like livestock, like cattle or durable goods, rather than human beings with rights, mere movable property. There was a complete lack of rights afforded to the enslaved. Chattel slaves had no legal rights or human rights and were to be bought, sold,
sexually assaulted,
or killed, and were subjected to all types of violence.
We'd like to emphasize that during chattel slavery, black people were actually treated like cattle, like a goat or a cow or a pig or a horse. They were treated as subhuman. They were treated as commodities that could be bought and sold on the open market, and they were in fact bought and sold on the open market. As a matter of fact, in 1711, New York City established the first official slave market. Black people were the first commodity sold on the market at the foot of Wall Street. This became New York City's official slave market, when enslaved African Americans and Native Americans were sold and rented for free labor.
Another condition of being enslaved under chattel slavery was that children of an enslaved person were automatically enslaved and passed down from parent to child, creating a permanent generational bondage. Your entire generation had not one chance of ever being free. The enslavement was a lifelong condition with no defined end date.
So imagine that. Grown men, women, and children were given to little white boys and little white girls as a piece of property. And they had to obey these little white children for the rest of their entire lives and every generation thereafter. So you had grown folks being told what to do by little kids as well as adults.
It was designed to last forever. In the American context, chattel slavery was deeply racialized, with people's enslavement tied to their race. Only black people in this country were subjected to chattel slavery. No other race of people.
Another thing that no other race of people were subjected to was breeding. Black people were bred in this country like farm animals. The slavery in this country forced reproduction of enslaved blacks to increase the enslaved population for economic gain, particularly after the transatlantic slave trade was abolished in the United States in 1808. Slave owners used sexual violence to impregnate and enslave women, turning enslaved people into a commodity to be bought and sold, as we said a little earlier. And they were exploited as property rather than as individuals with rights, human rights, and civil rights. So from 1808 to 1865, breeding farms were practiced and was legal in the United States. You know, and part of the shame of it all is sometimes the men that they would have as breeders were forced to have sex and impregnate their own relatives. Sometimes it would be their sister, their cousins, it didn't matter, even their mothers. And that was a shame. It's a shameful history. But that is chattel slavery.
Have you ever heard of serfdom? It's okay if you haven't. But basically, in some systems, like serfdom, individuals were tied to the land and served a lord, but were not considered movable property in the same way as chattel slaves. They often had a degree of social autonomy not afforded to chattel slaves. In essence, while slavery is a broad term for forced servitude, chattel slavery describes the specific system that treated human beings as objects to be bought, sold, and inherited as property, with no legal status as people. So there's a difference. During ancient slavery, in ancient societies, some forms of slavery, like in the biblical or ancient Near Eastern context, had different characteristics. Slaves had more rights and could and would be freed after a period, or were not treated as pure property, but as members of the household. Debt, slavery, / indentured servitude. These are forms of forced servitude with a defined end, often a set number of years to repay a debt or contract. While exploitative, they are temporary, unlike chattel slavery.
In debt slavery, a person is forced to work to pay off a debt. It was a common form of servitude in many parts of the ancient and medieval world. There was slavery as punishment. In ancient Egypt and other societies, captured soldiers or criminals were enslaved as a form of punishment. And that also had an end date to it. Once you serve your sentence, you were no longer a slave. And your children and your children's children certainly were not slaves. There was indentured servitude, where a person agreed to work for a set period to pay off a debt, such as passage to a new country. Unlike chattel slavery, it was a limited contract. But again, these people agreed to work for a set period. They were not forced to work. And then there was this system called serfdom, which was mentioned earlier in the video. This was a system of agricultural labor, prominent in medieval and early modern Europe, where peasants were known as serfs, who were bound to the land they worked on, which serfs were under the authority of a local lord and occupied the lowest position in the social hierarchy. They were just tied to the land for agricultural purposes. As a matter of fact, that's where the term landlord came from. And now, some other types of slavery.
Roman slavery shared the chattel characteristic of treating humans as property, but differed significantly from the race-based chattel slavery of the Americas by lacking inherent racial distinctions, offering greater potential for upward mobility and freedom, and having varying economic roles beyond just cash drops, including domestic, skilled, and public service labor. African slavery varied across societies, often a temporary condition of debt, punishment, or war with possibilities for freedom and integration into kinship groups. European transatlantic slave trade introduced this more extreme, racialized form of chattel slavery to Africa, devastating African societies by intensifying conflicts and exporting millions of people to be exploited as property. Biblical slavery was a complex system with different forms, including temporary debt servitude and permanent chattel slavery for foreigners, which differed from chattel slavery as practiced in the Americas. Biblical slavery involved some rights and temporary conditions, such as release after a set period or after physical abuse. However, the Bible does contain passages that describe permanent, hereditary chattel slavery for non-Israelites, demonstrating that the biblical text did not exclusively depict a system fundamentally opposed to treating people as property.
Now, there was also a type of slavery like the one practiced by Mansa Musa. And for those of you who may not know, Mansa Musa was the 14th century ruler of the Mali Empire, and he is widely considered the richest person in human history. Mansa Musa had control over the world's gold supply, and he was wealthier than any modern billionaire. His legendary pilgrimage to Mecca further solidified his fame and demonstrated the incredible extent of his wealth. That's who he was, a black man. The richest person in human history. He had slaves. As a matter of fact, his slaves accompanied him to his pilgrimage to Mecca. And his slaves were adorned in gold. They had so much gold that they were considered rich. They would be rich by today's standard. As a matter of fact, by any standard, his slaves were where they were enslaved for a certain period. And they were not enslaved for life, nor were they children and their children's children forced to be into slavery. They were actually able to marry into the family. So again, it was very different from the slavery that was here in America, known as chattel slavery. Now we have to take a minute to talk about the trans-Saharan slave trade, also known as the Arab slave trade. This slave trade began in 650 AD and has continued for over 1,300 years, lasting until the 1960s. Now, the Arab slave trade officially ended in the 1960s. However, it still continues to this day because there is little enforcement efforts to completely abolish slavery in some Arab countries. In countries like Mauritania, where 20% of the population, it is estimated, are still in slavery. And the only purpose is to house, farm, labor, and sex. And the slavery that goes on in those countries are still chattel slavery as well. So that's another form of chattel slavery that exists to this day. It's unfortunate, but it's true. Now we often hear about the transatlantic slave trade, but we don't talk as much about the trans-Saharan slave trade, which was just as, if not way more brutal, and it lasted a lot longer. And as I said, it's still going on to this day, as quiet as it's kept. It's like the Arab slave trade, they somehow get a pass, when it comes to slavery, but not on this channel. They definitely do not get a pass. The fact that slavery has not happened on American soil or in America, it's like a lot of people somehow forget about it, or they don't even learn about it. But as I said, on this channel, you're not getting away with it. So the next time someone says, yeah, that slavery existed in ancient times and, black people were not the only ones to go into slavery. Yes, that's true. But make no mistake about it. Black people in America are the only people on the planet who ever had the dehumanizing chattel slavery, where they had to breed with their family members. It did not matter where they with their children's and their children's children, to every generation who were slaves, and they had no chance of ever escaping that. And yes, there was slavery, but there was not chattel slavery, which is a distinct difference. So do not make that argument ever again that yes, black people were not the only ones to go into slavery. And as I said, although that's true, nobody else had to go to chattel slavery. Nobody else was treated like animals, like farm animals. Nobody else was dehumanized here in America during the enslavement of people. And through it all, yet still we rise. The Black Excellence and Abundance channel, where black history is every day. Thanks for watching. Please like, comment, share, and subscribe. And remember, thou art rich.